Although I can't see anybody. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Welcome to this ERCD seminar, hybrid seminar. So many of you are sitting online. And so today's seminar, we have JMenon from which institute?
ISIS.
Yeah, ISIS.
Yeah. ICS.
No, ISIS.
ISIS is
no
something else.
Not ISIS.
That's right.
Yeah, but anyway, I only know JMenon came from our ADB.
I'm here to help.
Okay, here to help. No, I love to help. Okay, JMenon actually, they are working with us. When I was in Ori, that's just here, the Office of Regional Economic Integration, which was merged to Economic Research and the Cooperation Department at that time. So Corporation C represented the part of Ori, the old Ori. So you joined, I think you joined Ori when I was there. No, actually you were in the Rainbow. If we talk about the history, that's the Regional Economic Monitoring Unit. That's the predecessor of Ori, and Ori was set up in 2005. Yeah, Jay worked in Ori, and even after Ori was merged, you merged also into ERCD in the front office. So welcome back to ERDI now, not ERCD anymore. So we are the Economic Research and Development Impact Department. So this seminar might be the first one under the new banner.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're glad to be the first one using ERDI. So Jay would talk about, is conducting a research on the Cambodia country diagnostic studies, which is support Cambodia CPS process, ongoing CPS process. And the title of his study is Overcoming Constraints to Inclusive, Sustainable, and Resilient Growth. So the seminar total length is 1.5 hours. And Jay, you may speak about 40 minutes, 40 minutes. And then we have two discussants. Paul Vandenberg from AREA would share some comments, as well as James Villaferte, our newly minted regional lead economist for Southeast Asia, would also share his perspectives. So let's start with Jay's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lele. And it's nice to be back. Thank you for having me back here. It's always good to come to get away from your regular work to focus on on a project, so you can try and get as much work done as possible. I have a lot of slides to get through, so I better get started. Oh, and thanks Paul and James for also being discussants for this event. Okay, now let me see if I can move this. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to move. Okay. Okay, I need to do that. I can't use. Okay, right. So this is quickly the outline. I'll start with some background and context, and then move on to saying a bit about diversification and inclusive growth. I won't say too much about this because of time. I know that Paul has raised this as an important issue, and I agree. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Then I'll say a little bit about different types of diversification. I think it's useful to think about it in terms of inter versus intra-sectoral, especially if you're going to draw that link with inclusive growth. Then the crux of the report focuses on the constraints, underlying constraints that need to be overcome. And these are not new to any of you, I'm sure. Human capital, all kinds of business costs, and the needs for growth to be resilient and sustainable. Now, I probably won't have time for conclusions, so you can draw your own, but let me get going here. Yeah. So, I think to start with, it's useful to recognize how far Cambodia has come in its recent history, right? And I would say that Cambodia is in fact Asia's true miracle economy. It's only 3 decades since the Paris Peace Accords, 23 October to when was it? 3 decades ago, 23 October, yes, 1981, right? Yeah, and 1991, sorry. And this was, ending the civil war that followed the ouster of the brutal Khmer Rouge regime, whose reign went from 75 to 79. And Cambodia was faced with having to build up its economy and almost all of its institutions from scratch. So this was a remarkable set of initial conditions, if you like, that it had to work from. And it has come so far in a relatively short period of time. So I think we have to note this, and I think it bodes well for the challenges in the future. And there are many challenges, that Cambodia faces, and that's what we'll discuss in some detail. Right. And despite this tragic history, right, Cambodia has great aspirations. It wants to become an upper middle income country by 2030. This is going to be difficult as a result of the pandemic that's hit everyone. And it also wants to become an industrialized country by 2050. Now, if it's to realize its aspirations or get close to realizing them, then it has to pursue inclusive growth that is also sustainable and resilient to all kinds of shocks, right? And so the aim, in my view at least, of inclusive growth is one that generates decent and sustainable jobs in the manufacturing and services sector, and fair and sustainable returns for those who are self-employed in agriculture or in the micro and small medium enterprises across all sectors, both formal and informal. So this is, I think, my interpretation of the objective of everything that we need to do from an economic and social point of view, right? And this should be this is what I mean when I talk about pursuing inclusive growth. Okay. Now, a key constraint to realizing that objective, and this is recognized in the rectangular strategy phase 4 of the government, and the Pentagon strategy that's coming up now that the election is over, and also the last CDS of ADB that was published in 2014, is the lack of diversification of the economy, right? And it was present during the last CDS, and it's also present today as a constraint. But it hasn't affected the pace of growth, but it has affected the quality of growth, especially the inclusiveness quality. Cambodia has had above 7% average growth since the turn of the century. You can see that here. Of course, the pandemic resulted in a sharp drop, but it's been growing very rapidly, and now it's recovering quite strongly, but the trend growth rate is much lower than the 7.6% in the past. But it has had very high growth because it's had a strong export sector driven mainly by trade preferences. Here it's garments essentially, but also other textiles and footwear and travel goods. It's had a booming tourism sector centered around the Angkor Wat temples and large capital and aid inflows. more recently, they've been mostly from China, but also from Japan and other regional partners, and the multilaterals, of course, and including ADB, that's the largest partner. A lot of that capital has gone into infrastructure, but also into other non-tradable sectors, and we'll come back to the impacts of that later on. Now, LDC graduation is imminent, maybe even as soon as 2027. And Cambodia will become a victim of its own success and lose trade preferences, and aid flows will also start to diminish. So new drivers of growth requiring new types of diversification will be necessary if it wants to realize that objective of inclusive growth. Right. So Cambodia has been diversifying, but the type of diversification so far has been intersectoral, right? And this is what I would call the early phase of, or the easy and early phase of diversification, driven mostly by rural-urban migration from agriculture into industry and services. But this is the old Harris Todaro type diversification, driven by expected higher wages. But it may be reaching its limit because wage differentials are beginning to narrow, and also the construction boom that actually sucked in a lot of rural workers is slowing as well, right? So that intersectoral transfer of workers and capital is slowing. It was also the one that was happening more naturally, right? Driven by factor price differences. And it was also less disruptive to factor markets, right? Skill levels were relatively similar. Workers in construction or even manufacturing in low skill assembly didn't require too much training in terms of absorption into the new sectors. But they produced output that was of higher value, right? Or engaged in activities or services that were higher value, not necessarily higher value added, but higher value. And so there was a one-off increase in the level of productivity, right? So the value of like wire harnesses being assembled was much higher than the rice that, former rice farmers were engaged in, right? But that's a one-off increase in productivity that raises incomes, reduces poverty, but it's not sustainable. You don't become better or more efficient at assembling wire harnesses over time, right? You do become a bit more efficient, but this is not going to be a source of productivity growth going forward, right? What you need to do is move into intra-sectoral diversification, or move up the value chain into higher value-added activities, right? This is the vertical shift. Earlier, we had the horizontal shift across sectors. Now it's a vertical shift within sectors into higher value-added activities, from labor-intensive assembly into production of parts and components that involve higher value added, right? Moving up the value chain in manufacturing through greater global supply chain participation. So this is intrasectoral, but inter-industry, right? So in developed countries, we have another stage of intra-industry specialization driven by scale economies, product differentiation, increasing returns to scale. Cambodia is not yet there for that next stage, but this is the prior stage of intra-sectoral diversification, but this is moving up into new industries within the sector. So specialization now takes place within services, within manufacturing, and within agriculture. Okay, but this stage is not as easy as the intersectoral stage. In fact, many countries are facing the so-called middle income trap. I refer to that because it's well known. I think there are a broader set of challenges than that implied by the middle income trap theory, but I think you all know what I mean. That's where many countries falter. In fact, the exceptions are the ones, the NIEs, newly industrialized countries that have broken through, and it requires a lot of government intervention, a lot of policy reforms, and maybe a lot of luck as well, right? If you are going to break through. But even to get to upper middle income, and even to be trapped at upper middle income stage, you still need to do a lot of things for a country like Cambodia, right? And there are two broad options. One is to have, a very ambitious industrial policy program, which, the US and even India and other countries are now trying to do to engineer this transition. Cambodia can't afford that. So it'll have to focus on the other option, which is addressing the underlying constraints through policy reforms by and large. There is a role for government support, and I'll mention that later, but most of it will have to come from policy reforms, right? And here there are three key areas that I will focus on. This is not exhaustive, but it's what I think Cambodia should prioritize, right? Right. So the first is human capital, or the lack thereof, and the skills mismatches that prevent upgrading within supply chains. The second is a whole host of the costs of doing business, and this is limiting the development of the private sector and domestic and greater inflows of foreign investment as well as domestic investment. And finally is the lack of resilience and sustainability, which threatens current and future growth. Now, here there are a number of sub-components to resilience and sustainability. The first, of course, is the existential challenge of our time, which is climate change and other environmental pressures. Second is a host of financial and related shocks, including health. It has to build resilience against those shocks. And lastly is technological change, especially this race towards a digital economy that has many benefits, but is also quite disruptive, right? Finally, improving sustainability of growth and its drivers involves diversifying trade and investment flows, right? Cambodia's trade patterns and sources are concentrated, as are its investment sources, right? Diversifying export products and markets, and even import sources. The Russian-Ukraine invasion has highlighted the need to have a diversified set of import supplies as well as exports. And all of these things will reduce the risk and increase sustainability of growth. Right. Sorry, I'm moving on a bit quickly because of time, but let me then now talk. Talk about the first of the three critical constraints in a bit more detail: human capital. I think we have to understand that for a country like Cambodia, the challenge lies at the very start. Even before primary education and secondary education, and this is the health development connection, which needs to be addressed. Malnutrition in the first 1,000 days of life is still a big challenge in a very poor country like Cambodia. And this has impacts not just with physical stunting that we can see, but also in mental development that has irreversible impacts going forward, right? So improving the quality of primary education is next, and secondary education follows. I know that there's a lot of discussion on TVET and tertiary education. These are sexy topics for development partners, but they can only succeed if students have a strong educational foundation. So we need to start much earlier. And the problem, I think, largely lies with improving access to education and retention rates. Now, in surveys of SEZs, including one that I did with Peter Wall in 2015, we found that MNCs operating in the zones are quite willing to provide training, but they complain about the lack of trainable labor, not trained labor. And what they mean by trainable labor is labor that can absorb the training that they're on-the-job training that they're willing to offer, right? So in 2015, in Denso, the world's largest ball bearing manufacturer, 30% of new employees had never attended school and could not read or write. So this is the ground reality of the human capital challenge. Not so much TVET, not so much higher education, but improving access to education and retention rates to allow more trainable labor. But I don't want to downplay the importance of TVET and tertiary education. Changes are occurring rapidly in Cambodia. I just want to highlight the fact that there are, basic challenges that remain even today that cannot be overlooked, but there's also rapid change. TVET and tertiary education needs to be more aligned with the needs of a burgeoning private sector to avoid skills mismatches, right? Like many countries in the region, one of the highest levels of the unemployed lies with recent graduates, right? And this is the definition of a skills mismatch. So we need to address that. And there are broader issues, right? We have to address the barriers that limit access to formal employment, right? And this is linked to the very large share of MSMEs in the informal sector, which I'll come back to, right? And finally, the pandemic highlighted the need to strengthen social protection systems. Now, these have been improving, especially as Cambodia has been raising its ability to raise taxes, collect taxes, but it's incomplete, even in the formal sector, and of course, it's non-existent in the informal sector, right? Next, the second constraint is business costs. And here in the CDS, I highlight 3 of them. And again, none of this is new. This was there in the last CDS. But the fact that we are still talking about it suggests that these are, systemic problems that need to be addressed. The 3 are limited physical and logistics infrastructure, high energy costs, and the high cost of finance. Now, starting with the first of these and noting, quite significant achievements since the last CDS, the infrastructure deficit still continues to add to business costs in a significant way. And this is because it's a moving target, of course, right? As you develop, your infrastructure needs also increase. So, this is why it's still there. And I think there's a need to prioritize investments both within and within the transport sector as well as in the broader economy, right? So within transport, I think the choke points such as port capacity and high cost centers related to logistics and intermodal connectivity are some of them. These are things that I think all of you at ADB know a lot better than me. I've been away for more than 3 years now, and I've forgotten already, but I won't try and lecture you on these things. I'll quickly move through them. But the point here I would like to make is that as ADB has been playing an important role, as well as the other multilateral, but increasingly BRI is an important provider of infrastructure services. And they've been doing a good job, I think, by and large, and the cost-benefit calculus is very much in the positive, but I think there is a need for better vetting of project proposals, right? And this goes beyond the BRI and beyond infrastructure. And I'll come back to that with the whole Sihanoukville mess later. But this is where I think it is time to seriously consider setting up an independent foreign investment review board or project investment review board operating as a non-statutory body, a bit like the one in Australia, but with interministerial and multi-stakeholder representation to assess and prioritize proposals, but in a purely advisory capacity, right? So the final decision still lies with the government, but I think what they need is an independent body that also centralizes, this decision, not the decision making, but the assessment process. Now, multiple ministries have different authorities for different types of projects, and it's a bit messy. It also creates avenues for corruption. That's the reality. But I think a centralized investment review body is long overdue. And with interministerial participation, the prioritization process can also be present, right? Within the transport sector. So I'll come back to this again a bit later on, but let me move on quickly. Yeah. So the next is the high cost of electricity, which is well known, but this is limiting vertical upgrading within supply chains, the move from assembly to for labor-intensive assembly to higher value-added, energy-intensive production of parts and components. You can't get that unless the cost of electricity comes down sharply. It has been coming down, but it needs to drop a lot further when you compare it with Thailand or Vietnam, right? So here we need to move away from the heavy reliance on diesel and heavy fuel oil in electricity generation, invest in grid extension, and where that's difficult or too expensive, to invest in the kind of solar park that ADB has been doing in remote regions. Again, you know all this better than me, so let me move on quickly in the interest of time, right? And, renewable energy is something I think is very important, but we can pick it up in the discussion. Last is finance, the high cost of finance, when it's so high for farmers and for MSMEs, it perpetuates poverty It limits to formal avenues of finance, increases the cost exponentially. Now, digital innovation, I think, has a big role to play here with fintech and blockchain. It's remarkable if you go, at least in the urban areas, how much digital finance is already being used. And of course, we have Bakong, which is the central bank's digital currency. But a lot of people, at least in the urban centers, are already quite tuned into the digital economy. But in the rural areas, literacy is low, digital literacy is low, and access to infrastructure is also limited, although all they really need is a smartphone, and many people do have one. But I think the whole cost of finance problem is tied into broader developmental problems, right? Governance, institutions, legal systems, and financial capital market development. This is also why Cambodia is so highly dollarized, right? These are all systemic problems of a transitional economy and long-term challenges. So once we slowly deal with all of these broader issues, with capital deepening of capital and financial markets, the cost of finance will come down. Right. Now, to wrap up the business cost section, I think we have to tie this in with private sector development, right? So high business costs, whether from transaction costs or poor infrastructure or high energy or finance costs, all limit development of the private sector, right? Now, unlike other Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia is lucky not to be saddled with a very large public or state-owned enterprise sector, right? The Khmer Rouge destroyed everything. There are about 15 of them, most of them not doing very well, a couple doing okay, but this is small compared to other countries. But this does not mean that it has a vibrant private sector by default, right? Most of the so-called private sector is still subsistence agriculture and MSMEs, many of them informal, right? So one does not imply the other. There are positive early signs. Brown Coffee is one indigenous company I like to talk about. And there are many others in finance as well. But I think a lot of work still has to be done in addressing business costs and the other constraints if we are to develop a private sector that can achieve the inclusive growth objectives. Right. Now, let me rush a little bit because of time. Now, the last constraint, of course, is increasing resilience and sustainability. Now, increasing versatility in managing and responding to disruptions and ensuring the sustainability of growth is what this is all about, right? The general need to increase resilience and sustainability. The first, of course, is climate change and environmental pressures. This year's ADO highlighted this point, and in Cambodia's case, it showed how it could be up to 10% lower than otherwise in 2050 due to loss in labor productivity as a result of extreme weather events and so on, right? And damage to infrastructure. So economic growth and environmental protection were once considered trade-offs, but no longer the case, right? There are many ways in which it's trade-off, but there's also complementarity, right? And the intersection is the so-called green growth agenda, right? And there's many opportunities for investment. UNDP in 2019, a report on de-risking renewable energy investment identified 900 million worth of opportunities in solar photovoltaic investments, PV investments, right? So there are a lot of opportunities, almost 1 billion, could be higher. Now, transitioning away from the heavy reliance on fossil fuels, as I mentioned, as well as broader challenges like reducing the rate of deforestation, adopting more sustainable agricultural and fishing practices are all important in ensuring resilient and sustainable growth, right? But the green growth agenda is now becoming more important commercially because a lot of MNCs with their CSR objectives, right, require this in their selection of different investment sites, right? So reducing the carbon footprint would actually be commercially important for Cambodia to attract the future new types of FDI in environmentally sustainable products and services, right? So it's very much a commercial element to it all, right? Now, the next dimension of resilience relates to financial and health mainly. And here again, I don't want to spend too much time, despite its importance, because this is well known to ADB. There's been a proliferation of both banks and non-bank financial institutions, and shadow banking has been on the rise. Now, this inevitably raises the risk of a financial meltdown. In fact, a number of people are, surprised one hasn't happened yet, and that's good news. But I think the risks are there and sometimes growing, right? And requires greater regulatory oversight and supervision. I think the NBC has been doing a good job, but the challenge is a big one, right? And there's a need to strengthen resilience by enhancing regulatory supervision by the NBC, improving asset quality, implementing regulations that deal with bank restructuring, corporate insolvency, and debt restructuring. And debt, both corporate and private, has been rising, right? And the pace of credit growth cannot be sustained. And I think systemically important banks that have high exposure to construction and real estate are particularly vulnerable, especially as forbearance measures that were introduced during the pandemic start being rolled back, right? And there's a need for consolidation, right? And this will require, an increase in minimal capital requirements, but this has to be done carefully, and especially, in the microfinance sector, right? And there's lots of other things that are required, like deposit protection schemes and the need to crack down on money laundering, which is suspected to be very high. Right. Now, from finance to health crisis, I think Cambodia did very well, given its level of development in managing the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know about the remarkable high vaccination rate, 5th highest in the world, highest among developing countries. But I think it highlighted a number of vulnerabilities that need attention before the next crisis, right? Next health crisis. Government spending on healthcare is very low comparatively, right? 0.7 hospital beds per 1,000 people compared to 2.6 in Vietnam and an OECD average of 4.7. This is, extremely low, right? There's great variation in access to quality healthcare, especially in the rural areas, and there's a need to increase the overall quality of healthcare in general. During the pandemic, when lockdowns were implemented, I think many were asking the question, flattening the curve, which had a lot of costs, especially on the poor, but flattening the curve for whom, right? Very few hospital beds, and who could afford them? So this is a challenge that needs to be addressed before the next health crisis. Now, let me move on quickly to tech change, and here especially digital economy. As I said, many benefits from it, including financial inclusion, but also there'll be adjustment costs, right? Low and medium skilled jobs may be lost initially, but all jobs are at risk, especially with AI. And redeploying low skilled workers will not be easy, right? And will require a lot of reskilling and retraining. Now, if you've been to Phnom Penh, you would have seen a lot of cyclo drivers now who are basically sleeping in their cyclos, right? The digital revolution has made it so easy to use PassApp and Grab. In 2014, cyclos were predicted to be fading into history. They've survived somehow, but I think the pandemic might have dealt them the final blow. And these are generally, low-skilled and old workers. How do you retrain, redeploy these types of workers, right? So the challenge is a huge one. But I think despite the rise in anti-globalization sentiment everywhere, Cambodia must remain open to importing skills and technology to help it catch up in the short run. And it should not be tempted to try and keep all the good jobs for locals or, close off, foreign firms from coming in to try and engineer the growth of indigenous firms that, like some countries are doing. I think it needs to remain open. It served it well in the past and will continue to do so in the future. Now, I realize time is running out of time, so let me quickly move on. But there's a need for fundamental changes in the education system to move towards lifelong learning. And I think we need, greater investments in skills development to move towards an innovative economy. Let me move on quickly here. There's public-private partnerships as well that can play a role. But the last point I want to make before concluding is the need to diversify trade and investment flows to improve its sustainability. During the global financial crisis, Cambodia was one of the most badly hit in ASEAN because it was so heavily reliant on the US market, right? And the US had a huge downturn. This needs to change. Now it's so heavily reliant on China for trade and investment. So it's shifting one source of concentration to another. It needs to diversify. And some of this will happen naturally as, it addresses a lot of those constraints to diversification, right? Give you one example. If it's able to reduce electricity costs, then it will be able to attract new types of FDI from new countries, right? From Korea and Japan, not just China. These are the countries that are investing in global supply chain industries. And this will allow upgrading within those global supply chain industries to parts and components. So you'll get new types of exports, new sources of investment, and new types of imports and exports, right? So you diversify trade patterns by addressing the electricity cost constraint to diversification. Losing trade preferences will also diversify export patterns, right? Naturally. But there's a lot of explicit policy changes that can also be done to help diversify trade and investment, right? Preferences are not just limited to GSP. In a lot of in all of Cambodia's FTAs, there are preferences, and the margin of preference is still high, right? For many tariff lines and across FTAs. This concentrates imports by diverting them from natural non-FTA partners that might be the cheapest supplier, and therefore increased trade diversion, which is welfare reducing. So pursuing open regionalism should be a no-brainer. You know, if they can multilateralize their trade preferences, this will reduce concentration in trade patterns and increase welfare. Of course, loss of tariff revenue is a concern, but I think it's a false concern. But I don't have time to get into that. Finally, you know, a country like Cambodia needs to attract more FDI or incur more debt if it's to grow faster than its low savings rate. But there's sustainability elements to both of them, right? We know or hear a lot about debt sustainability, but there's also an FDI sustainability element that's often ignored, right? When FDI exceeds its absorptive capacity, it can put pressure on the tradable goods sector through real exchange rate appreciation. This is the real exchange rate that I'm talking about, the price of tradable versus non-tradable goods, and this can result in Dutch disease type effects. In fact, it's already there, I think, with the massive investments in the casino complexes in Sihanoukville, a lot of which now are lying bare and empty, right? So I think the point here is that a transitional economy like Cambodia, with a lot of constraints and structural constraints and weaknesses, has to be selective in its choice of projects, whether domestic or foreign or debt or financed, and if it is to grow in a sustainable and inclusive manner. And again, I think it's time for an independent review board to try and examine each project and conduct comprehensive cost-benefit analysis to avoid the kind of projects that has left neighboring Laos on the brink of bankruptcy, right? Or at least severe debt distress. And this, I think, is where I will stop. And I'm sorry, Lele, I went a couple of minutes over time, but thank you for your attention, and also those online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay, for this really packed presentation. And we do have a draft. Yeah, although it might be shorter than the previous comprehensive country diagnostic studies. So we have two discussants. The first one actually is Paul. Paul was the author of the previous country diagnostic studies. So Paul, 4 years. So 10 minutes maybe, and then Jay.
I don't know if I'm going to go 10 minutes, but see, maybe short is better. No, and as Lele talks about, you know, we're looking at our country diagnostics, trying to keep them shorter, trying to keep them more focused. So a longer length is not something that we're interested in, but getting to the point, which I think you do quite well. You know, I kind of, you know, I went through the presentations, going through the paper and so on, and I kind of felt like I was, you know, going to a buffet at a high-class hotel. You know, there's just a lot there. It's all good. I have nothing to argue against. It's just the size of my stomach that limits me from partaking. So, you know, I just generally it's a good overview and analysis of a lot of the key constraints, and it's broad enough, I think, to cover a lot of aspects as the environmental sustainability issue, the inclusion issue, of course, the reduction and let me just point out a few things that come to mind when I read this, and you know, I don't know if there are things you need to respond to today or maybe think about in your draft and so on. I think one thing that strikes me is, and we all have this as economists, we look at economy, we think about constraints and so on. A lot of the analysis, especially the business costs constraints, what is it based on? Is it based on our understanding of investors, and they see these as their key constraints? I mean, how do we know this? You know, I could look at that economy and say, yeah, that probably makes sense that these are key constraints, but how do we know that these really are the constraints, both for foreign investors to come to Cambodia or to continue to come to Cambodia, as well as domestic investors? So that's kind of my question here, and I think, you know, sometimes the way we get around this, or the way we address this, is comparative. You know, we look at constraint, the costs and delays and so on in Cambodia versus other countries at a similar level of development, and we can see that they are particular constraints. So I think that's one of the thing that sort of just strikes me. I think we've had this discussion, and I always think the best thing to do is to try to survey investors that don't come, and why aren't they coming? But you know, that's a research-wise a very difficult thing to do. But I wonder if there's any better information. The other thing that I find a bit interesting and is in many ways a lack of focus on agriculture. Now, I understand the perspective you're coming from. It's manufacturing and services, developing those, diversifying those, and so on. But you know, the way and you know, you did talk about the structural shift of labor and so on. But I wonder if we've given short shrift to agriculture in the sense that when we think about countries' development, and certainly countries at this stage, we often think about, well, actually, it's very important to develop agriculture while you're doing making these other shifts, because it continues to provide us an important foundation. There's a lot of labor that's engaged in agriculture, and therefore we should think about that. And so a lack of a discussion about agriculture, I think, it just bothers me a bit, in the sense that maybe there are important gains to be made from improvements in agriculture, right? Now, you've talked a little bit about it. You talk about the intra-sectoral shifts that take place, moving up the value chain, which occurs in manufacturing and services, but also, of course, occurs in agriculture, and then just the overall issue of increasing productivity and output. And so that's one of the things that I thought would be interesting. The other thing that struck me, but again, I don't know how to work it into the analysis really, is I think a fair amount of what has happened in Cambodia is foreign investment. And so we look at the garment sector, it's foreign investment driven. We look at some of the initial stages of diversification. It's how to attract foreign direct investment. But my wonder is more about the domestic business class. I mean, is there a domestic business class that's developing? And are there ways that the government could focus better on this class, help this class develop, and so on? Where is it developed? Where is it? I mean, obviously, it's probably a fair amount certainly in construction, but what's the whole dynamic of the domestic? You talked a lot about, you know, going from Khmer Rouge to present day, and that miracle happening. Is that process also the process of developing a stronger domestic business class? I think that would be important. The discussion about environmental issues, climate change, resilience, all that, I think is interesting, but it kind of left me a little bit lost, in the sense that a lot of those issues actually affect agriculture. If I'm not, I mean, that's certainly they affect other sectors, but they affect agriculture a lot. But we don't have a big discussion of agriculture. So if there is a need to build resilience and sustainability, I would think that that is connected to agriculture. I mean, if foreign investors are going to set up plants to manufacture things and so on, that's fine. But I don't know if that's affected by climate change. I mean, it is in some ways, but I would think so. So this concern about environmental sustainability, and so I would think it'd be a strong connection there with agriculture and how that would work. I think that's most of what I have to say. I think the discussion about the financial sector was interesting. You talked a little bit about there needs to be more finance, but then at the same time, there seems to be a bit of over indebtedness. Maybe the financial sector is not well managed and needs to be better managed, but I guess it's finance going in different directions. So that's interesting. But I guess the other thing that you didn't really talk about was macroeconomic management. You said some nice things about the central bank, but I think that if I'm understanding correctly, is that the financial sector aside, particularly macro management has been good in Cambodia, and maybe it's actually been one of the factors that has attracted investment, that they have a very stable macro environment, even though highly dollarized, along with.
So that's one of the good things.
Exactly.
Apparently, yes, which the NBC won't agree with, but.
And also, one of the other factors may be, whether you like it or not, a stable political environment. We just had
Very
elections
stable.
in which there was no opposition. So again, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but for economics, it's often a good thing. This final recommendation, very interesting recommendations about this sort of foreign investment review board, that idea. I think that was really interesting. I guess my question really is that a problem, particularly because of the casinos in Sihanoukville, and does it relate mostly just to that? Is there a lot of infrastructure otherwise that's coming to the rest of the countries through the BRI, through other forms, that are not really problematic? I mean, the country would welcome that. Obviously, there are infrastructure deficits where it needs to welcome that, and so on. Are the expected returns on that really questionable, and therefore a need for this review board? So I just wonder if we've got sort of two things happening there. Maybe a problem with casinos and certain types of investment, but then not a problem with the rest of it. Maybe that is a possibility, and so we can think about that. Let me, I think, stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. So James?
James is here. He's joined us. James, can you?
Yeah, James?
Hi there, Lily. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I'm on holiday in Melbourne, but I always enjoy whenever Jay presents. So I said I will not miss this, even if I'm on holiday.
Thank you, James.
And really, thanks, Jay, for a very well structured and thought out piece. I was really happy hearing from the presentation. You captured the country context of Cambodia well. I think presented some of the more important wins of the country over the years, particularly its role in attracting FDI and developing light manufacturing, somehow diversifying a bit from garments. I also support the view from Paul about the very successful macroeconomic management in Cambodia, which is, I think, quite advanced. I was going to Cambodia looking at how fast they developed their monetary policies, and even in terms of expanding to the digital payment system. And I think you've captured the critical challenges that Cambodia is facing. A few thoughts about, I think, government capability, especially at this juncture of the economic development of Cambodia. While I think macroeconomic management is really quite done well, I think Cambodia still needs to improve its state capacity in terms of industrial policy, in terms of supporting the industrial transformation and development of the country. I think Cambodia, it's easier for a low cost, a low wage country to join the global participation rate. But I think the challenge is really upgrading its participation rate once it's entered the participation rate. And that's where I think the role of the government's industrial policy in making sure that Cambodia's firms, Cambodia's industries are well placed and have the government support and have enabling environment and policy ecosystem to really expand its participation and diversify its participation rate. I think the policies needed to enter and the policies needed to upgrade are quite different. Particularly, I would like to see more policies, I think probably discussion in terms of how Cambodia will really try to upgrade Cambodian firms already participating in the global supply chain. How will it plan to improve its product? How will it plan to improve relationship among different firms within the industry? How will it try to improve process? And even particularly, how will it access some of the necessary inputs like skills, technology, innovation, and even available supply? I think one of the key constraints of expanding the country's participation in the global supply chain is this limited supply base. And that's where you also need to focus on industrial policy that expands the industry. You need to have policies that will probably build more supply base so that you don't import, you reduce the importation of inputs that you need for your participation in, for example, bicycles. And this is really where you build what we have been talking in economics in terms of agglomeration, effect, network, externality. And I think here the needed inputs are not just the ones that were used when they tried to enter the global supply chain. This is really upgrading their access to technology, upgrading their training, not only in terms of secondary and tertiary, but probably more skilled training at the firm level, and also increasing the interface between firms, foreign firms and domestic firms, because this type of learning and this type of knowledge is really from peer to peer. It's not obtained from the educational system. I think the other aspect that has to be probably looked into is in terms of creating clusters. How will Cambodia? What's Cambodia's view in terms of creating clusters? And this is not only limited, I think, to industrial sector. And for example, Paul was talking about how should we expand the focus on agriculture. And when you look at the agricultural supply chain, I think it's really strengthening the agro processing in agriculture so that you develop more domestic food, which is important for maintaining food security, stabilizing the agricultural supply chain in terms of shocks. And this will require, I think, a different kind of policy. And I just wonder how Cambodia will actually address those policy. I think the other aspect that I was also wanted to read more is the role of tourism services sector in Cambodia, because I think it's quite an important area, and also it's also a big source of employment. Although I think there a lot of the employment are really probably not the high quality type of employment. These are where most of the informal sectors actually can be located. But what's our view after the change in the tourism market in the region? How should Cambodia actually restructure its tourism market so that we get this inclusive growth, we provide them with jobs and income, which is more stable and at the same time probably more resilient to shocks such as what we observed during the COVID. The last probably the last comment probably I would think, especially in terms of the upgrading, is the importance of logistics for Cambodia. I think that's really where the next when you try to look at how you leverage on the digital, and this is also quite true in the Philippines, even if you have a good digital system, when the logistics system is quite weak, you're not there when the goods is delivered, then the cost of moving goods around even Metro Manila is quite weak. And I think that's where more investments and more well thought out policies on how to strengthen the transport, distribution, warehousing, logistics in Cambodia would also give more lower the business cost, particularly for those firms that are participating in the GBC. I'll stop here, Jay, and really enjoyed reading the draft.
Thank you very much. So we have already got to discuss, so probably we let you to respond first before we open the floor. Okay.
Yeah.
Jay.
Thank you. I won't try and respond to everything because I think we've already gone over time. And I want to hear more from others here and online if they have questions or comments. But thank you, Paul and James, for the very useful comments. Maybe I'll just pick up one or two things. I think, Paul, you mentioned, by the way, I agree with all the issues raised. It's a question of, again, prioritizing and fitting it all in. And this is essentially a one-man show producing this report. I wish I had a bigger team, but on the last point you raised, which I thought was the key question you wanted me to address also, is this thing, this project investment review body I'm proposing, whether it should just be to avoid the kind of casino type problem they had or infrastructure in general. I think certainly it's to avoid, the casino type development, which has been very detrimental. I think, it's displaced a lot of local businesses. It's brought in a lot of criminal element and other sort of social ills. I mean, poor country and you want to go to a gambling-led growth model is not the way I think forward, right, for Cambodians. But it's also in infrastructure. I think it's true. So far, it's been quite good, right? A lot of the infrastructure projects by multilaterals and BRI have been good for Cambodia, right? The latest, of course, is the Phnom Penh Sihanoukville freeway, which is apparently doing quite well. Some don't think so, but I think overall it's a very good freeway from what I've seen, and has increased, connectivity, and both for people and for cargo, etc. The issue, I think, is how the future, right? And again, I mentioned Laos, the rapid rail link that has seen it basically, distressed. And Cambodia is flirting with this idea too of rapid rail links. I don't think these are good investments, but if you must have them, then you need to pay the right portion, right? Laos paid 30% out of, only, but that was still far too much, right? If you do a proper cost benefit, because most of the benefits actually accrue to others, right? Now, for China, having this network in its Belt and Road program is important, but not having one element of a network means the whole thing crashes effectively, right? So the opportunity cost is very high for China, the benefits alternative is also equally high. So I think a more correct sort of appropriation of costs would have been closer to 10% for Laos and 90%, maybe, not just China. I mean, beneficiaries are Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, everyone, right, that uses the network. I think that's the issue, right? There's no formal quantitative cost benefit analysis currently being undertaken for huge infrastructure projects that can threaten that very good macroeconomic conditions. I agree with you, they manage the macroeconomy very well, but everything will be at risk. It can be at risk with one project, right? Like we saw in Laos. We've just seen in Laos, right? And that's what Cambodia should be careful about. Maybe they can avoid it with their current mechanisms as they have, but I think having an independent body won't hurt. If Australia sees the need for it with their good quality institutions, I think, a country like Cambodia could benefit from it, especially given, the reality of high levels of corruption that we must accept, right, that operates. And this competition between ministries for a share of the rent seeking, right? And I think in that environment, having independent body, again, advisory role would be beneficial. Yeah. But let me just stop there and let others. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay. Yeah, we have already got some comments from online, so we go to online first. Lindsay, do you want to speak on your comment posted in the chat box?
Yeah, look, it's
Please.
just a comment. It's just a comment from Phnom Penh that we're working in the agri sector and with the Ministry of Finance at the moment. They have indicated, and the government at the highest levels indicated, to use 2 economic poles or clusters for agricultural development, one in the northwest and one in the northeast. So what Tito James was asking is in fact government direction. The other part, which I'll let maybe Eric talk about, is my understanding is that there is going to be a public investment review board established post-election. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Zen Josie, you have posted a question. Do you want to speak or?
Sure, okay, surely. Thank you, Jay. I posted my question on the chat box, but I'm just really curious because the CDS of Cambodia was very interesting. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, I'm just really curious if there was an effort or you had a chance to see how Cambodia has diversified, to what extent, based on what were recommended in the original study, since economic diversification remains to be the main theme for Cambodia. And yeah, just want to see if there have been achievements based on that study, and if yes, somehow what factors contributed to the success, and how can we ensure that they are sustainable, and in this case inclusive, as well as contributing to a green objective, particularly let's say in the garment industry or sector. Yeah, I think I can stop here, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question basically about the first CDS. Yeah, how
So ask you to answer.
I don't know.
to run that.
You should evaluate it. not me.
Okay, so let's open the floor. We already got 2 from online. Here, do you have any? Okay, Conga.
One question.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
which is not specific. Yeah, thanks for the very comprehensive presentation. It's covered all the challenges that Cambodia is facing. Just one question, and it's more not specifically to Cambodia, but in terms of economic development. So as you said, Cambodia decided to really focus on garment industry, right? And now it's looked that they will I mean, it will be very difficult to produce any electric or electronic components like other countries like Vietnam, closer to Cambodia. And given the priority in terms of climate, do you think that there will be an opportunity for Cambodia to just pass from garment to producing solar panel? Or do you think that they need to go through this economic development stage that Asia experienced, like first producing garment, then electronic components, and then so that's my question, because yeah, you mentioned it's I mean, I think the main issue in Cambodia is really education, and I mean, people tend to forget that the country has gone through the Khmer Rouge, and there's bunch of the population which is missing. So we don't have the basic education, the basic skill. So as you mentioned, most of the people, even in the urban area, they cannot read, they cannot. So I mean, yeah. So I'm just wondering if the skill needs to be higher, and how. I mean, that's my question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Probably you collect another comment from Kokob, then you can respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jay, thanks for this presentation. I have also gone through your CDS report, which has very clearly make a distinction between that with the existing all these constraints to growth. Still, Cambodia was able to grow at a high pace, more than 7% over a couple of decades. But then you have rightly picked up the point that basically what we have to look at the quality of the growth, which is the inclusiveness, where it is the economy is lacking.
Right.
So I think to make this point more clear to the readers, one possibility is that we can elaborate more on this thing in the context of balance of payment constraint growth analysis. And the crux of that analysis is that up till now, because of trade preferences and a concessionary ODA inflows, have temporarily relaxed the constraint on the capital, on the growth, and enable the economy to grow at a higher pace than otherwise. So in going forward with LDC graduation in anticipation, and as you have pointed out in the report that trade preferences will change, that will affect the export competitiveness, and also ODA inflows will be dried out. So if that's the case, then we can bring in out that what could be the likely new drivers of growth. And then you can probably point out the importance of export diversification. And I had already shared one of our empirical analysis that we conducted in-house in ERDI with the Cambodia Residence Mission, where we have pointed out the high potential export products which country Cambodia is still exporting, albeit with not comparative advantage. So the report can then identify that through addressing some of the constraints that you have mentioned, how through industrial policy government can help upscale private investment into those otherwise high potential products. So I think that will help understand that the dilemma that apparently with all those constraints that you have identified, how it enabled the economy to grow at a high pace, and why there is a need to change the, why we need new drivers of growth in going forward.
Okay. So Jay, you may respond to a future set of questions.
Okay, right. No, thank you. Thanks everyone for those very useful questions. I think some are, comments that I need to consider in revising the report. So I won't try and provide definitive answers here. It'll take some time for me to think about them, but they're all very useful suggestions. I didn't know that there was going to be a public investment review board established after the election. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I just hope that, there are lots of these sorts of boards and committees floating about, right? Let's not confuse that point. I mean, when I talk to people working for the government or working in the government. They do tell me, oh yes, but we have this meeting that we have, and I hate to say this, but some of them might just be rubber stamping, and go through the mechanics of review. This is why I think, if you look at how the Foreign Investment Review Board in Australia operates, right? They are subject to public scrutiny as well, and the public can put in submissions, right? And they call for that, and the Productivity Commission does the same thing for government policies, not just investments, right? So there is that level of engagement and scrutiny and accountability. I think that's what's missing, not more internal government review boards, right? And it also needs to be not just, of course, every investment project the government engages in, or even every investment proposal currently from overseas, goes through a process. At the moment, the CDC reviews it, right? But the CDC is tasked with really the handing out of fiscal incentives, right? And you can see, I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? This is, you have to ask why did will happen, right? It's obvious that this was going to be what it was, but it happened, right? Under scrutiny of these sorts of processes. So it's not enough, I think, is the point. And the level of accountability needs to be increased. Also, I mean, to be fair, we can't blame the CDC. I mean, they don't have the task of looking into broader macroeconomic impacts of these types of projects, right? That's not their mandate. So there is that aspect missing. Whether this new investment board will have that mandate, I don't know. But certainly there's a need to look into it, and there's a need for quality, properly trained staff that can conduct quantitative cost-benefit analysis of often difficult projects to be supporting whatever investment board, review board that's established, right? And that is critical, I think. So if that's the plan, I'm very glad to hear that it's happening, but I'll need to be convinced that that's exactly what it is, and not another review board, internal review board. I think, Dulce, you raised the point about how much diversification has happened since the CDS. Paul, please come in if you like, but since you're the key author of the last CDS, but from what I can see, I think diversity, Cambodia has been diversifying, right? But in that intersectoral kind of way, mostly, that's still ongoing. We've seen some reverse migration now from the pandemic, from rural back to urban, which actually has been pushing down wages in the urban sector, right? With this new inflow of workers returning after the lockdown started, which is not good for the rural sector, actually. So there's some of that that's been happening. And of course, a lot of the investments from the Chinese investments actually in agriculture has been helping diversify agriculture, right? Into new higher yielding crops. There's also rice milling taking place, investment from China and other Vietnam and so on. So there has been diversification in agriculture as a result since the last CDS. But I think in manufacturing, Chinese investments have still continued in garments. There's been some movement up the value chain in garments, but we've seen that in Sri Lanka in the past, where they moved to quite high levels within garments. But I don't see that happening in Cambodia. Sri Lanka seems to have captured that, and Bangladesh is trying to, with much lower wages. So I think in Cambodia, the movement, intrasectoral diversification has to come from, electronics and automotive parts and component assembly. And I think this comes to your point, Swana, as well, right? How can they get that? Electricity costs are coming down. If they can come down more, then Cambodia still has that lower productivity adjusted wage advantage, right? Compared to Vietnam or Thailand. And so, and with all the geopolitics going on, right, with the US, China, and so on, they could try and capture a bigger share of the FDI leaving China, or a bit more of the Chinese investment leaving China. China itself is moving out of China, as we know, right? So that's where I think that diversification going forward can happen. So, but there are real big challenges, with skills development that I think need to be overcome. Kalkap, I haven't seen the analysis, but maybe we can talk about this. Yeah, that's right. But I would like to see what I can get from that for the final revision of the CDS. Sure. Yeah, that's right. But I think the points you made are very important. It's pretty much the framework I have in mind as well. Yeah, these are constraints that continue to bind.
That's right.
Yeah, they've been relaxed somewhat by favorable conditions, right? Preferences, and also aid and other types of concessional flows, and also capital flows. But going forward, I think all of this is drying up and changing. So Cambodia needs to really restructure the way in which it can grow. This one last point, and this comes to what James and Paul was saying. Yeah, so I think, I'll try and add a bit more on agricultural value chains. In fact, I did a study with CDRI on this, and we just published a book looking at the various non-tariff barriers within each stage of the agricultural value chain that need to be addressed. And I think there's a lot there for future development. The reality is that, depending on your time frame, if you're looking at 10 years, a lot of the kind of social inclusion or inclusive growth that will happen in Cambodia will have to come from agriculture, right? So that, I think, is something, you're right, it's not present enough in the current CDS. It's going to grow a lot longer, but I think I'll need to try and take that on board. Yeah, but thank you.
Conscious of the time, it's already almost the top of the hour.
I know.
We have a few hands from the online.
Okay.
There's Albert may also want. So we go to online first. Yeah. So Eric, do you want to share? By the way, Eric is also helping with the CPS.
And he's also given me comments already.
Good to see you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And I guess like James, I too never miss an opportunity as far as I can to listen to Jay, particularly on Cambodia because of his long experience there and knowledge. I don't have specific comments. I just want to say that I'm very glad to see in the report a specific recommendation. So the Foreign Investment Review Board, I think, is very specific. And the problem we have with these diagnostics is that, it holds together internally. It's a good product, but our job, I think, is to go beyond that and offer to government concrete recommendations. So that wasn't, I think, the terms of reference of Jay's work. He has presented very, very nicely, as Paul has said, the menu available, the buffet available. But I think our job as ADB is to present, what is medicinal and what is digestible to government. In other words, how do we marry the higher level constraints or even the specific constraints to the political economy that we know in Cambodia, right? We know more or less how the system operates there. So there's no point recommending things that are not implementable. And we need to weave in governance issues into the recommendations that we make. And I think as an example, the Foreign Investment Review Board is a very good example of that, because it marries the higher level constraints with the specific constraints that will address both the distributional aspects of growth and the rate of growth that Jay has mentioned. I guess in the work that we need to do, so not necessarily in Jay's work, we need to try and make these specificities clearer. And so part of the CPS will be to do that, to draw out, what we can operationally achieve, right? Things that are realistic and doable in the time frame available, that don't aim too high, but don't aim too low. Easy to say, hard to do. But I think this type of work, which sort of connects the points, is very, very valuable. I would agree with Paul on the agricultural side, particularly on your last point, Jay, that this does involve more inclusive growth aspects, and that needs to be more specified. The problem in Cambodia is that these agricultural value chains are very long, and the longer the value chain, the more opportunities for all sorts of things to go on along it. And none of these issues are new in Cambodia. They're the same now as they were 2 or 3 decades ago, even probably. But the urgency perhaps is higher now, because preferences will go, graduation will happen, external shocks are bigger and more volatile and happening more often. And so the time constraint for Cambodia is perhaps more prescient now than it was before. But just to say, this is excellent work, but we're not there yet. We need to extend this into the CPS and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. Then there's AG1. You said you have a quick comment on the investment board, specifically comment. Okay, AG1.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Tony Gill. I'm out here.
Tony Gill, that's AG1. Tony Gill.
Oh,
Yeah, in the Cambodian resolution. Yeah.
I'm trying to get my video to start, but it won't. Oh, there it goes. Look, just a couple of quick questions. I know we're over time. Jay, please reach out to me over the Public Investments Committee, Priority Infrastructure Committee structure. I'm leading the work ADB is doing to support its preparation. DFAT is leading the work on skilling the staff in the teams to be able to do the cost-benefit analysis. We've got a team of people writing guidelines, standard operating procedures. The committee will be run by a subset of people from the Council of Ministers, so it's extremely high level, and if that's now going to be run by Vissoff, and you know how astute he is about sensible public investment. So I have a lot of faith in that process. When you talk about Foreign Investment Committee, I'm not quite sure whether you're seriously talking about foreign investment in the private sector. I mean, the investment law has just come through, which treats all Cambodian and foreign firms the same. There is no difference. I'd hate to see that change. If we need to have more oversight over government allowing business licenses for certain types of industries, then I think that should apply to domestic and foreign firms, not just foreign firms. That's just my thought.
Yeah.
On improving the domestic business class, totally agree with you. We have been approached by the International Business Chamber asking us to help them set up a Institute of Directors, and the government is supporting that move. Unfortunately, I hit a brick wall when I came to ADB and asked for any assistance on that. Apparently, that is not something ADB does and supports, but there certainly is moves here to do that. One of my the other thing I wanted to say about the electricity costs, yes, they're high, yes, they're coming down. Thailand and Vietnam are increasing, so the comparative difference is getting smaller, but it's still too high, I agree. New policies have just come out in terms of companies being able to use renewable energies on their factory sites, but the implementing regulations and the limits to those haven't come out yet. I just want to defend the sector a little bit. It's electrified 93% of villages since 1992, which I think is such a magnificent effort. But of course, the cost of that is also the cost of electricity. 63% of energy generated in Cambodia is renewable, and ADB is working on an additional 2 gigawatts of solar energy, a plan for solar energy as well. And I think there will be certainly be exporting electricity to Singapore in the next decade as Singapore runs around the region trying to find all of the supplies of electricity it can. Just one other thing, one of the constraints we have to private sector investment and economic diversification here, in addition to the ones that you talked about, Jay, and I don't disagree with any of them. Firstly, we have an industrial plan for the textiles, footwear, garment and travel sector. There are some industry plans for some selected agricultural commodities. The government's working on an agricultural industrial park. So things are moving in the right direction, but there is a need for more industrial plans. I do expect the new administration will come out to us and start asking for those. They do need them. They know they need them. The government, of course, is saying, look, we will put in place the policy and the connectivity for economic diversification. But these logistics plants, etc., they need to be private sector financed. And one of the problems we keep running into here is the low size of private sector investments. They're too small to attract an awful lot of overseas interests, and we need to find ways around that. But that's it from me. Reach out on anything you want to discuss later, Jack.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Tony. Albert, you want to do something?
Yeah, I had 3 quick comments. One is, I'm not an expert at all in Cambodia, so I learned a lot today, so thanks for the great presentation. The first is, I really expected more about the understanding who the poor are, as ADB, like the profile, what are the poor doing, where are they spatially, and then how does that, feed into what we're talking about in terms of what economic activity can really lift up the poor, especially given their human capital profile and their employment profile. So I think that's, should get a much elevated discussion.
Sure.
And the second is, one thing that struck me in the numbers is that this is a country where the structural change in employment has been really fast. Like in a decade, the percentage of people in agriculture moving to industry and services, I've never seen any country do it that fast. And so I'm just curious how, how disruptive that process has been. And yet it's still a very poor country where wages are low. And you pointed out the fact that, there isn't a huge wage difference anymore, maybe even between rural and urban. That's very striking. It suggests to me that there's still quite a lot more scope for demand to increase for these workers. I mean, in China, you saw a similar thing. That's what a country I do know, where wages stayed low for 3 decades and then they started rising. But it took that much time to really keep bringing out the cheap labor from the rural areas. And then finally, when it became a shortage, then wages started going. That's really when living standards started to really grow fast in China. So if we're not at that point yet, I wouldn't overly discount the ability to just keep doing what they're doing and keep moving people out until you start seeing those wages to take off a bit. Certainly, let's not do any industrial policy. I'm very against it, but that's not the direction of the recommendation. I was curious on the trade part, because I do think the big bet should be to be global, to participate in global value chains as a small country. That's how they're going to get technology. That's how they're going to lift productivity, just even with the limitations of the skills of the workforce. I was curious why they're doing these individual country free trade agreements with China and Korea when they're already a part of ASEAN, which also has free trade agreements with. So that's curious to me. I'm wondering what additional benefits they're trying to get from that, and if it really positions them. But anything about the GBC work, we're doing a lot of this kind of analysis. I would try to draw that into it, because the opportunities in trade are really different now than they used to be, because global value chains are much more specialized than they were when, the NIEs grew. The last comment is on this foreign investment, or you can tell from all of the everyone has commented. So I'm a little bit worried that it is going to distract attention,
Yeah.
So I think it's good to point out the governance issues and failures, and that something needs to be done, but I'm not sure. I mean, despite the previous comment, whether you want to put something out there and spend so much time defending something like that. I wasn't really sure conceptually what this board would do, in fact, because I feel like there's many different types of foreign projects. If it's an infrastructure project, it really is about public investment decisions, right? So it would be great if governments had a process to propose and approve and prioritize public investment projects like roads, bridges, other infrastructure. And that should be done before they worry about who's going to be contracted to build the road. In other words, and I think good countries do this in a very transparent way. I visited Myanmar even, where they were going to set up something like this, a project bank. And it was an idea kind of pitched by the World Bank that they decided to adopt, where the project bank would be the list of projects that the government is prioritizing, and would get a lot of scrutiny, including the public scrutiny, public comment procedures, anyone, other stakeholders would comment, that would have to go through this whole before it could get into the project bank. And then those were the only things they would fund that had gotten through, because they were worried that corrupt practices often are like some government official cuts some deal with some foreign government to do this project. But if it has to go through this vetting to get into the project bank, and the government commits to only do these projects, it's very hard actually to do that kind of under the table. But those public projects, and I guess that's what the Public Investment Review Board would be focusing on. I don't know any of the specifics, but that's very different than FDI, right? FDI, private investment projects, for most countries, they just want to get as much of that as they can because they figure it's good for the economy, right? And so that's why I think there's some, why do we want to really be creating hurdles for these projects? In fact, in many advanced countries, they're being used for very political reasons, right? To keep out projects from countries that are viewed as threats, et cetera. Although, I mean,
countries
that are viewed as undesirable or something, okay, right? I mean, often anti-China. I mean, in recent years, right? In U.S. and Europe and Australia too, I think to some extent, right? And I'm sure that's not the point here, but so you have to be very clear. So if we're worried about this, the gambling casino projects, I think we should just step back and think about what failed, right? And what would be the criteria that would need to be employed because those are private investment projects, I guess, right?
Yes.
I guess. So I would just draw that distinction. And then the other last issue is about the debt sustainability. You said Laos is overly indebted. That's a very important consideration, but that's kind of almost a separate analysis that has to be done by people in the Ministry of Finance and then put limits on both the public infrastructure financing and even maybe other types of big projects that are leveraged with external financing to set limits. So there are different processes, I feel like, for the debt issue, let's get good infrastructure projects, and what are the right restrictions on FDI.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. Yeah, sure.
Sorry to go on.
Okay, thank you very much, Albert. Yeah, I'm conscious it's already 15 past, but we still got two hands there. They are very existing. So Chan To of our Cambodia reservation, are you still there?
Yes, good morning. My name is Chan To. I'm Senior Project Officer at Cambodia Resident Mission. I would like to say that the report presentation is quite unique and quite good. And I would like just to share some of the understanding. It's about Cambodia histories and also geology. I think speakers already mentioned that we have come across Khmer Rouge, and then followed by centralized planning. It takes decades, and also especially for Cambodia, SME, it's affected by those. It takes generation to have a new managers who come from their own families and replace the fathers and all of that. And now we can see that younger generation who have graduated from, foreign countries and all of that, they come and take the business. And I think if the condition in the country, it's more open and more conducive, the future agribusiness and export and all this can take faster than the last decade or the last 2 decades. And I think what the speaker also mentioned, but cannot talk so clearly, I think we already know that Cambodia is facing huge corruptions. And that corruption bring all the costs of, businesses, transportations, and finance, and all of that. And it also bring not many competitive people in the public sectors and all of that. But if that corruption is not going to resolve, many of these costs will not be possible. And I think those foreign investment, they might not be able to come easily. And secondly, Cambodia is living in the 2 major economies, Vietnam's on the east, Thailand on the west. Whatever happens in policies, in politics on the other side, it will immediately impact in Cambodia. We can see that major of Cambodia laborers come to Thailand. It's not one day happen. It's because of a well plan in the Thai side, so that they can graduate their citizen to focus more on the IT, digital, that have more money, and bring more of the Cambodian side to fulfill all of that gaps. So what I wanted to say is that these diagnostics that can provide, short terms or immediate or long-term strategy for Cambodia or option for Cambodia, should also look at the policies of the neighboring countries. What are they planning to do with their citizens? What they want to graduate next? And then what Cambodia, for example, now, Cambodia can see and have a lot of benefit of the improved working conditions in the Thai side. They have more money, they can send back those money. But then Cambodia will also need to think what happened the next 10 years when those workers come back. Are we utilizing their strengths or we will treat them there or pay them with pensions over here in Cambodia? And also whatever they have done on the other side, for example, climate change, adaptation, resilience, it will impact in Cambodia. For example, if they have, for example, now they have El Ninos, they already start to think about reducing rice production, conserving water, and major of the water will be coming from Thailand or come from Thailand to Cambodia. So those, when the preparations on the other side, Mekong rivers and all of that, it will impact on Cambodia. So I mean, all of these factors, it's not just thinking what is happening in the countries, but also to think what is happening in the other side, and also competition between China and America. So this is probably difficult for the team to make prediction who is going to gain more and who is going to lose more. But that will also impact on the choice that Cambodia will choose. So this is, I just want to Thank you very much. That much of the study, it will I will use it, and I will look for the product. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chanto. And very quickly, Faris, you may also say a few words. Are you still there?
Hello.
Hello?
Yes. Thank you. Just a quick comment. It's more about the cost of finance that was mentioned earlier. It talks about it's part of the high cost of doing business. It also talk about increasing capitalization, making institution bigger, more efficient. But the problem in Cambodia is that, as you mentioned, as well, the private sector is not efficient. We have seen an example, the government tried to put an interest rate cap on multi-finance costs, and they shift by adding fees in order to cover the loss in the cost itself. But you did not touch on the role of state-owned enterprise. You casually mentioned that there's 15 of them. In a system such as this, what should the government do? Should they mobilize, example, the development bank, the state-owned development bank, to channel more in order to reduce cost of funding? Say you talk about agricultural value finance. How do you do it? Should you be more specific there? Because there's no way, given that the dollarization of the economy, that the central bank can affect effective monetary policy on a domestic basis. Because the challenge is to always be tied to the US, and whatever the Fed Reserve does will affect the domestic market. Funding are all international. All banks try to get access to the dollar funding on an international basis. So it's a very challenging environment. They're trying to build, example, the domestic currency. They have tried to develop the government bond market and all that, but it's still a small component of the market. So how should the diagnosis look at how to address the cost of finance? We can talk about, I would say, international investment, foreign and all that, but if the cost of financing activities in the economy is so high due to poor intermediation by the whole system, how should you address that? It's more of that, just to like more of a query to the writer. Thank you. Just that.
Okay, thank you very much, Faris. Yeah, very useful comments.
Just a
Oh,
couple-
yeah.
I will take into consideration time limitations. Thank you very much, Jay, for sending us those drafts to review and read, comment on them. So I will just briefly mention that, in my opinion, you have very good point about the need for diversification, and indeed it was mentioned that in the previous country diagnostic study, it was also one of the keys. But at the moment, I find it's a bit theoretical. So I think like we can make it more practical in the sense that usually when you say diversification, there is always question where, what sectors, subsectors. In the previous country diagnostic study, there was like this product space analysis, which was kind of like quite detailed. And here we can either repeat it or maybe use something different like trade gravity model or other tools available in order to bring it more to kind of like a greater detail in order to have a meaningful conversation with the government in that regard. And the second one, you talked a lot about the labor sector and that needs upskilling. That's quite interesting. But what struck me, like when I was looking at some statistics on Cambodia, it's like their unemployment rate is just 0.4%, and it's really low. And I was like wondering, like, why is it so low? Like 0.4% is like full employment, and we kind of like need to touch on that. Maybe there are some like issues with the statistics, how they reported, how they're recorded. So I think in that regard, we can also like enrich the discussion and offer some suggestions. Thank you very much, and looking forward to working.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So Jay, you have got a huge set of, you want to respond in 1 minute, then we close.
1 minute. Okay. So I think, Albert, you asked specific questions. Thanks everyone for the comments. And I will I've written them down. I'll seriously consider all of them. But I think you actually had questions, so maybe I can just respond to your questions. Okay. Okay, who are the poor, etc. Why damage? Actually, it's in the report. I had so much to cover, so I thought I will only focus on things that ADB might not already know or focus on too much. Yeah, but just on that point, I think that big issue is, poverty has come down sharply. A lot of it is still rural, but a lot of people hover just above the poverty line. And that's the problem, right? Yeah, any small shock and, the poverty rate can double. Yeah, and we saw some of that during the pandemic. Yeah, and that's the challenge. It's the very sharp reduction, only I think bettered by maybe China and Vietnam in poverty.
We're still 18% on their own poverty line.
Yes.
And 30+% at the $3.
It's still there. Yes, that's right. Yeah, but it's come down from 7.
Of course.
Right? Yeah, that's right. So, but poverty, not discounting the fact, but again, even that 30% is perhaps an underestimate given the number they hover just above it. Yeah. It has been rapid transformation from rural from agriculture into non-agriculture, let's say, manufacturing and services. And a lot of it's in construction, actually. But there's also been very sharp wage rises, right? So,
it has, okay.
Yeah, that's right. So compared to, a lot of agriculture, subsistence, non-wage, but if you take a shadow wage or a wage equivalent, right, the gaps were quite large. And despite the rise in agriculture, terms of trade, agricultural prices, the rise in manufacturing wages have been very sharp. Yeah. So I was told that, with overtime, a worker in a manufacturing plant in a zone could earn up to $400 a month, right? When it was like $100 a decade ago. Yeah, that's right. That's with overtime. The minimum wage is about 200 now, I think, right? 200 US. But with overtime, it could be almost double that. Yeah. So there has been huge, very sharp rise. In fact, some people are raising this as a concern, but I think it's good. I mean,
it's good for development.
Good for development. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, that's right.
Not great for business.
Why so many bilateral FTAs? I wake up in the middle of the night screaming about this as well. I think it's because it's not about trade, right? FTA is about everything but trade. It's about politics. It's about strengthening ties with countries you want to strengthen ties with, right? And well, I mean, you've got Cambodia is a part of ASEAN, right? That includes almost all the countries it has FTAs with, but still it wants to have bilateral FTAs because it sees this as a means of actually improving market access. Many of these are not really implemented, right, on the ground. They don't have the capacity to do it, and when they do, it's an opportunity for rent seeking, right? So, you have a product coming in, no one can measure rules of origin effectively. Even US can't do it. I mean, given that any product now is probably produced in 50 to 150 countries. But, you have customs officials who say, well, which rate do you want? I've got 5. You want the lowest rate? Well, you pay this fee, right? Yeah, that's right. Or you want no rate at all. That's a different fee, I guess. I mean, this is why I think multilateralizing them, like the original ASEAN countries have done, there is a good, real example of how this is practical. Multilateralizing them, offering them, harmonizing and then offering them to everyone will allow Cambodia to better manage its trade tariff regime and also use regionalism to globalize, right? Cambodia is a very global economy already, right? Its main trading partners are US, EU, China, not necessarily ASEAN, but that's also had its own distortions, right? With trade, GSP and other preferences. But it could clean all that up if it chose the multilateralization route. And given its domestic capacity, it could manage it a lot more easily. Yeah. The concern about losing revenue, I think, is misplaced because a lot of it is privately collected, not publicly collected. And I think, trade will grow as they multilateralize, and then you collect a smaller share of a larger volume. And yeah, but finally, yeah, your points about the Foreign Investment Review Board or National, I'm still struggling with those, but all the points you raised, I think, are good ones. A lot of public so-called infrastructure investment is foreign related, right? It's private, so there's a clear role for that. But yeah, as far as managing other public investments with multilaterals, there is a lot of due diligence that already takes place from the side of the multilaterals. So I think that one is okay. The concern is when you have private investment in infrastructure, a lot of it BRI related, and how that is sort of assessed in the context of the broader macroeconomy and debt sustainability, and also proper cost benefit analysis, I think. Yeah. So yeah, it's a bit complex, these different sources, but I think there's certainly gaps to be filled, and a question of how it's filled and what types of checks and balances can be put in place. But yeah, I agree with you. There's some gray areas there as well. Yeah, just very quickly. Wow, I've got so many others. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Already 32 minutes past.
Yes, that's right. Sorry. Yeah.
So let's thank Jay for
Thank you all.
really good presentation. Such a fruitful discussion. So thank you very much.
Looks like we should have started.
Ah,
at 10.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming also. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.